Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we are back today for episode 18 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we're going to talk Dynasty Breakouts. So I have 3 players at each position that I want to talk about that I think will really take the next step into being an elite or a very good Dynasty asset over the course of this next season. So, like I said, 3 players each position. And before we launch into that, I just want to remind you all, if you've missed any of our previous shows, you can find them on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Don't forget to follow the show and find us on Twitter as well, at Dynasty War Room. And that'll be important because we have a big announcement coming up for the show, and we'll tease it a bit on Twitter. We're going to make that announcement next week, so make sure you come back for next week's episode for that news. So with that, let's just jump right into things. And like I said, we're going to start with quarterbacks. And the first guy on my list is Anthony Richardson. So Anthony Richardson is already a very highly valued Dynasty asset, but the reason he's on this list as a breakout is for the fact that we really haven't seen that much of him, number one. But number two, he's currently going off the board in startups. I take that back. He's valued as the quarterback 7 in Dynasty on Keep Trade Cut, which is not a perfect website, but they do a pretty good job of capturing sort of the current Dynasty value of players. I've mentioned that site multiple times before on the show, and they give you kind of a good snapshot of where the Dynasty community currently values players. So right now he's quarterback 7. He's going late first round in startup drafts on Sleeper. So this is somebody that at 22 years old, we only saw him for a few games last season before he got injured, which of course is the big risk involved with Anthony Richardson, is the health, along with the fact that we don't have a very large sample size. However, in the sample size that we do have, he was awesome. I mean, this guy, whether it was throwing the ball, running, he was extremely effective on the ground. And an interesting stat that I stumbled along on social media was that Anthony Richardson averaged 0.76 fantasy points per dropback last season, which is the highest not only of any quarterback last season, but is also the best over the past 3 seasons. So that is a very high mark. And of course, we play this game for fantasy points, and so having a stat like fantasy points per dropback can be something that's very helpful, and it's a relatively predictive stat for fantasy football for future projections. And so while the sample size was small, that type of mark is very exciting to me. It's something that I think we as Dynasty players can look at that and say, look, the ceiling is really high, because if he's able to put that number up over the course of an entire season, you're talking about somebody that could finish as a top 3 quarterback, the number 1 overall quarterback. I mean, Anthony Richardson is one of the very few players in all of the NFL, in all of Dynasty football, that if he has a very good season, he could be the new Dynasty 101, the first overall pick in Superflex startup drafts. I mean, this is somebody that could be Josh Allen because of the fact that he is a very high-level running quarterback. He's very young. He throws it well enough, and so as long as that can improve, and he's in a very good offensive situation in Indianapolis, the Colts drafted Adam Mitchell. They've, are loaded up at the skill positions with Jonathan Taylor, Michael Pittman, and Shane Steichen is a great offensive coach. So all the ingredients are there for Anthony Richardson to really jump from this, we think he's going to be good, to this guy's elite type of quarterback. And so that's why I'm perfectly comfortable with his rank in startup drafts, where I'm comfortable where he's going in redraft, in best ball, and underdog. Like I think that Anthony Richardson is a great risk to take. Somebody that's worth it, that's worth the risk because of that really high ceiling. There's just so few players in all of fantasy football that can reach his level of production, that if everything goes well, there will never be another time in his career where you can get him for his current price, which is admittedly high. The chances that you're going to be able to go out and get Anthony Richardson from the manager that has him in your league, very slim. But if you have, a comparable player in that range, or, maybe the manager in the league is somebody that isn't as tuned in, if you're listening to a show like this, you're probably pretty, clued into what's going on across the NFL and fantasy football, but your league mates are not all, putting in that work in the offseason. So it's worth, seeing what you can get, or what it would take to get him if you are in need of a quarterback. But I have high hopes for Anthony Richardson. I've, bet on him to have a strong season in several of my leagues. So that's why he's number one on this list of quarterback breakouts. Next up on my list is going to be somebody that I think you can classify more as a post-hype sleeper, post-hype breakout. He's not really a sleeper, but the breakout for Trevor Lawrence is something that we've been waiting for a couple seasons now. I mean, this is number one overall pick, all that talk of one of the best prospects of all time, best that we've seen since Andrew Luck, and he's really only been okay in the NFL. He's been all right. He hasn't been as good as expected, especially for fantasy football. I think he's probably someone that is a better real-life quarterback than he is right now in fantasy. However, he's only 24 years old. I think there are enough people down on Trevor Lawrence that he is somebody that you can acquire, and he's finally going to have what, in my opinion, will be his best wide receiver room. You could debate, the merits of Brian Thomas versus Calvin Ridley, and but they did draft Thomas in the first round. They have Evan Ingram at tight end again. Christian Kirk, I think, is going to be the wide receiver 1 on this team this year, and they signed Gabe Davis. So there's some players here, and he's being valued as quarterback 13, which to me seems like it's closer to his floor than certainly his ceiling, but really what I think he is. And I fully expect him to make that jump back into the top 10 following this season. I think he's finally going to put all the pieces together. As long as he can stay healthy, that's going to be the key for all these players. Like you mentioned, Richardson coming off of an injury. Lawrence was banged up a little bit throughout the season. But Lawrence is another guy that, while he's an elite passer, he also does have a bit of a rushing floor. So he had over 300 yards on the ground. And if he can keep that up, this is somebody that, will he ever be, a 101, 102, 103 type player in a startup draft? Probably not. I don't know that is still in the cards to be this, MVP level quarterback, but he certainly is somebody that can be better than what he was last year, and I think better than how people view him currently. And so I do expect another level up for Trevor Lawrence, and is somebody that I think now is the time where you can go get him. And the team that has him could be somebody that drafted him at the 101 in his rookie season, so he might not be that excited about parting with that pick. But if it's, a league mate where your league started more recently and it was a, second round startup pick, third round startup pick, whatever the case may be, and they just don't feel like they've gotten a good return on that investment, you can go out there and make a good offer. And he's not one of those guys that's going to be untouchable. So Trevor Lawrence, number 2 on my quarterback breakout list. Third on this list, I'm going to go a little bit down on the value chart now. We're outside of that top 15 range. We're talking about Will Levis, who is currently valued as the quarterback 21 on Keep Trade Cut. He's actually older than Trevor Lawrence, but this is somebody that, he hasn't played as many years. Obviously, coming off of his rookie season, he was not the starter until late in the season. But this is somebody that, if you're looking to try to acquire a high-level quarterback 2 for your dynasty team that you can have start for the next, 5 to 7 years, Will Levis is somebody that can be that guy. And this will be the year for him to, prove it. Because as an early second-round pick, he doesn't quite have the runway that a first-round pick would have. So in a way, it's really a make-or-break type of year for Will Levis. But I'm optimistic given the weapons that he has with Calvin Ridley, with DeAndre Hopkins. They went out and they also got Tyler Boyd, and they have 2 pass-catching running backs in Pollard and Spears. So this is something where with a new coaching staff, I think they're going to throw the ball a lot more in Tennessee, and Will Levis should benefit from that. He's a gunslinger type of guy. He kind of gives me flashes of, Jameis Winston almost, where remember he had that year where he was crazy for fantasy with 30 touchdowns and 30 interceptions and just throwing the ball all over the place, racking up yards and touchdowns. So I could see something a little similar to that, but hopefully a lot fewer interceptions. But I don't know if the ceiling is quite as high for him, but he certainly is somebody that can be an impact starter on your team. Someone in that 12 to 16 range, maybe even up to QB 10, something like that. It's going to be something where his true impact on a year-to-year basis will probably go up and down with his touchdowns. But in terms of him being able to lock down the starting job, give you a young starter that can be acquired right now for relatively little, I think it's a good bet, because if it hits, you're certainly going to return a lot more on your investment should you then choose to move on from him in the future. And if he doesn't work out, you still got at least 1 year of some level of production from a quarterback, which, as we've seen in the past, there's always going to be spike weeks. There's always going to be a reason to have depth at quarterback. And for, an early second round pick, something at the 1-2 turn in your rookie draft, I think if a lot of people might be looking at this as a Will Levis versus Bo Nix type of situation. And I don't see that much of a distinction between the two. So if you want to, aim for the ceiling play, I think Levis has a higher ceiling than somebody like Bo Nix. I don't know if he's necessarily as safe or will be given as long of a leash since he was not a first-round pick, but that just gives you some context there, I think, in how I see him. And I think he's going to jump up. I think he's going to be valued higher than QB 21 at this time next season. Moving on to running backs. First up on my list is Zamir White of the Vegas Raiders. Now, Zamir White is somebody that he's valued right now at running back 19, and at 24 years old, he really doesn't have any significant competition with the Raiders. There is Alexander Mattison. They drafted Dylan Laube late in the NFL draft, who's more of a pass-catching guy. Don't expect him to be a full-time type of running back in the NFL. But this is somebody that, after taking over in the last few games of the season, was really, really good. I mean, he averaged just under 24 touches per game, which is an awesome mark. And in his last 4 games in PPR scoring, he had 17, 14, 15, and 13 points in those 4 games. So I don't know what more you could ask for somebody that's being valued as, a middle to late running back 2. You can get him for a mid to late second round pick in a rookie draft. And I think that's, a good value. He's somebody that could be a true workhorse running back, which in today's day and age is extremely difficult to find. Now, whether that 4-game sample is just a flash in the pan, it certainly could be. But if it's not, this is going to be a team that they're not just going to be able to throw the ball a ton. They didn't really improve their quarterback situation that much. Gardner Minshew is not somebody that, is some massive upgrade in the passing game. So, a minor one, sure, but it's going to be something where the running game is still going to be, leaned on for this team. So at running back 19, I think that if he is truly the workhorse running back that I think he will be, I would expect him to creep up a few spots next year. I know running back values are a little bit difficult compared to the other positions because it changes so dramatically from a year-to-year basis, given their shorter window of being a high-level dynasty asset because of their age and things like that, and the fact that teams cycle through running backs so much. But Vegas is going to be a rebuilding team. if he's good this year, there's no reason for them to go out and draft a replacement early in the draft when they have so many other needs. So I see him staying somewhere, in the mid to early teens next year, and that's why I have him as a breakout, because I think we're going to get a full season of him being a workhorse running back. And even if he's an inefficient player, if he's getting 20 touches a game, he's going to have fantasy value, is going to have a pretty good fantasy season, and he's not somebody that most teams are counting on to be their running back 2 on their dynasty teams. I mean, this is somebody that probably was picked up in a rookie draft in the 4th round or, acquired relatively cheap prior to the season. This is not somebody that had a ton of value heading into last season. So that he now all of a sudden he's already jumped up very significantly in value, but I think his true on-field breakout is coming in 2024. Another guy that I think their true breakout is coming in the 2024 season is Chase Brown, running back for the Bengals, who, with Joe Mixon gone, he's going to be splitting a backfield with Zach Moss, who was brought in as a free agent, and I expect this to be a pretty full, committee. I don't think this is going to be something where Zach Moss dominates the backfield or Brown dominates the backfield. I've mentioned on previous episodes that I like Zach Moss as somebody, if you're a contending team, to try to add on the cheap. I think that you can probably get both Moss or Brown for like a 2-3 turn rookie pick. And I think that's a pretty good move to make if you're a contending team, because 24 years old, Chase Brown, he's valued right now as RB38, and I don't see a world where he finishes worse than that this upcoming season. And so given his age and the fact that at worst you're talking about a high level, second back in a committee for a good offense, a good team, I think that's somebody that you want to get on your roster. He can catch passes. He's an explosive player. He was a great college running back at Illinois. So Chase Brown, somebody that I think there was definitely some hype for coming into the NFL, but then when he fell in the draft a little bit, I think some of that hype kind of went by the wayside. But that's back. Joe Mixon out of the picture. Again, I just don't know that he's going to be a full, workhorse type of back like a Zamir White. In fact, you could probably package Chase Brown in a later pick to go get Zamir White. But this is somebody that, again, I think a breakout is coming. I think his dynasty value is going to shoot up from running back 38 to somewhere in the 20s, potentially early 20s, depending on the type of year that Zach Moss has in terms of injuries, because he did struggle a little bit with staying on the field. So this is another guy a little bit further down the board, especially compared to the quarterbacks, because the 3 quarterbacks we talked about a little bit bigger of dynasty assets, whereas these running backs are a little bit lower on the board. And the third running back that I actually have is even further down than Chase Brown. So I have Jaleel McLaughlin, who is 23 years old. He's the running back 50 right now on Keep Trade Cut, which is, I think, far too low given what his likely role is going to be. And I think he's being valued at running back 50 largely because people are unsure of what that backfield is going to look like, because it is a little bit crowded in Denver. There's Samaje Perine that's still there at the moment. Javonte Williams, they just drafted Audric Estime. Blake Watson is, having some buzz as an undrafted free agent. So it's definitely a crowded position room in Denver. But this is somebody that is a pass-catching running back. That is what he does best. He's not going to be somebody that is a bell cow or a workhorse, anything like that. This is not going to be a 25 touches per game guy. However, Sean Payton has always run an offense where there's sort of a ground and pound type of guy and a pass-catching running back. And McLaughlin could very easily turn into the full-time pass catcher in this backfield. There's Javonte Williams, who's in the last year of his contract. He can do everything, but I don't know that Denver wants him to do everything. We've seen this commitment to continuing to bring in other running backs. Williams has, struggled with health in the past. And Samaje Perine is likely on the way out. He can be cut for salary cap savings, so I would expect that to be the case probably post training camp. So it's not going to happen for a while, but that's why you can get in now on McLaughlin, because I expect this running back room to be Javonte Williams, Audric Estime, and Jaleel McLaughlin come September. And that's going to mean that all of Samaje Perine's production will be up for grabs to be split among those other players. Samaje Perine had 50 catches last year for over 450 yards. He also had over 200 yards on the ground. So even if you just assume that his rushing yards go elsewhere, Samaje Perine, 50 catches? That's a really good number for any running back. And the fact that, he wasn't even the starter or anything like that. McLaughlin caught 31 passes last year. So you'd have to assume that at least half of Perine's workload goes to McLaughlin. So that's putting him at over 50 catches. That's putting him at over 500 yards. He ran for 400 yards himself last year. So this is somebody that you can get for dirt cheap. And while he's not going to turn into, just some top 10 running back that you can have in your starting lineup every single week, he's going to dramatically shoot up from running back 50, especially given his age. This is somebody that's probably going to jump up to the early 30s, late 20s, and he's going to be someone that you won't want to pay that price to acquire after the season, because then you'll be stuck in this, he's the pass catcher, he's not a full-time guy, what do I do with him? Which, at that point, he's a hold. So now is the time to go acquire him. I don't think there will be ever another time to get him as cheap as he is right now. And there's a possibility that Javonte Williams does not stay in Denver. We're talking about a situation where if this coaching staff gets what they want, it very well could be Audric Estime is the, heavy duty between the tackles goal line guy, and then Jaleel McLaughlin takes that Alvin Kamara role and is catching passes and lining up in the slot and, being the fantasy back to own. So the ceiling is pretty high here. And so that's why he is on my breakout list and is somebody that I would love to add in a dynasty league, regardless of whether you're a contender or a rebuilder. I don't really think it will matter with him, and he's somebody that you should go target. Now, moving on to wide receivers. I mentioned we're going to have 3 players at each position. I do have some honorable mentions at wide receiver because there were a handful of other players that I could very easily put into this category, but I wanted to kind of spread things out a little bit and not go too top heavy, since, it is a bit difficult as it is to acquire some of those guys that are, younger and have high expectations, but just haven't hit those yet. So the first guy on my list is kind of the most obvious breakout wide receiver you can possibly pick, because everybody in the world thinks the breakout season is finally coming, and I am included in that, and that's why I am going to bring up Drake London as my first player, because while it is very obvious, this is somebody that was a top 10 pick. He's finally getting the quarterback play that he needs to, be a top 10 dynasty wide receiver, be a top 10 redraft wide receiver, and Kirk Cousins has shown that he can support that type of player, and I've always been a big fan of London coming into the NFL. I thought he was a very good prospect. He was my number 2 prospect in his draft year behind Breece Hall. And the only downside to Drake London is that his dynasty value has already skyrocketed to the point where, number 1, you're probably going to have a very hard time acquiring him. And number 2, there's not a whole lot, higher up that he can go. He's currently valued as wide receiver 12, and his redraft ADP is actually he's higher than that in redraft. He's being taken at the 1-2 turn, about 13th overall on Underdog and best ball drafts right now. So, people are very bullish on Drake London. And while I think in redraft taking him at the 1-2 turn is a little risky, I do think that's probably where he's going to finish in terms of how good he is. And if he's worth that late first round pick and redraft, that means that he had an awesome year, which I think is going to be the case. I mean, he's only 22. He'll turn 23 during the season. He'll have Kirk Cousins, but even if Kirk Cousins is not fully healthy or doesn't carry over his play for Minnesota, Michael Penix Jr. was drafted in the top 10, and that's somebody who we saw at Washington can certainly throw the ball around and will be able to do that better than the quarterbacks that were in Atlanta last year. So Drake London, the super obvious breakout candidate, I think it's coming, and he's going to be one of those guys that is valued as a top 10 dynasty wide receiver for the foreseeable future. Now, number 2 on this list is Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers, who is finally healthy, hopefully, fingers crossed. It sounds like there was, quite the issue with the, a difference in strength between his hamstrings, and it seems like, by all accounts, that is getting corrected. He's working on it. He has all the information he needs now to take care of himself and, get his body ready to go for the NFL season. And he's only 25 years old. He was an early second-round pick, and now he has a good quarterback. I mean, Jordan Love broke out last year. He would have been the perfect candidate for this type of episode a year ago, and he showed that he is a high-level NFL quarterback. And the only downside really to Christian Watson is that he can't stay on the field. He's got the quarterback situation. He's got a good offense. It's going to be a pretty good team. They play in a division where all the games are going to be high scoring. I mean, talk about the offenses in the NFC North between Detroit, Green Bay, Chicago, and Minnesota. It's a good division with good offenses. It's going to be high scoring games. And Christian Watson, in my eyes, is still the wide receiver 1 on this team. He's being valued as the wide receiver 36 overall on Keep Trade Cut. And I think the general consensus is that Jaden Reed is being valued above Christian Watson. He is certainly going ahead of him on Underdog, but I don't know that I agree with that. I actually think that if we assume Christian Watson stays healthy, I think that Watson is in for a breakout year. I mean, I think he's their deep threat. He is Jordan Love's go-to guy when healthy. When all of Green Bay's wide receivers were on the field together last year, Christian Watson was the one that was targeted. He had the highest target share. I mean, this is the guy, in my eyes, you want to own from this Packers offense because he's no longer costing you, a first-round pick to acquire. I mean, this is somebody you can get for a mid-second in a trade, and I think that's a pretty good deal. So while I do, like Jaden Reed and I like Romeo Doubs, but in fact, I really like Dontavian Wicks. I think Wicks is certainly another guy that is a common breakout candidate right now in the Dynasty community. I don't know that I quite see the ceiling for Wicks as some others, but I do like Wicks at cost more than somebody like Dobbs. And, knowing that you can get Wicks for relatively little, I think he's another guy that, if you want to go target and go get, I have no issues with that. But Watson to me is if you're looking for a true wide receiver 1 that can be a week-to-week starter for your dynasty team, Watson to me is that guy, and I think he shows that this year, as long as he stays healthy. Number 3 on my breakout list, a wide receiver, is further down the list. Again, you'll probably sense a trend. I'm trying to, have some higher level assets, some lower level guys. And this is somebody who right now is wide receiver 59, who I think will significantly outpace that following the 2024 season. And that is Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. Shakir is probably my favorite breakout candidate on this list altogether. He came on really strong at the end of this past year with and now he has no Stephon Diggs, no Gabe Davis. He frankly was outperforming Stephon Diggs at the end of last season, even with him there. So this is somebody who's still only 24, and while there is added competition now with Keon Coleman and Curtis Samuel and a couple fringe roster type of guys like Claypool and Marquez Valdez-Scantling, I'm not sure that both of those guys stay on the team this year. And if they do, I think one of them is probably going to end up in like a wide receiver 4 or 5 type of role. But Khalil Shakir, to me, is somebody that can be the wide receiver 1 for the Bills. I just have a hard time seeing Keon Coleman coming in and being the number 1 receiver right away. I think Curtis Samuel will certainly provide some competition. They paid him a lot of money in free agency, but Shakir is the guy with the highest ceiling in my eyes in this wide receiver room, for at least for this upcoming season. Coleman certainly has a high upside of his own, can certainly develop into a number 1 receiver over time, but I don't think it's going to be a year 1 thing. And so if you're looking for somebody that is going to have, in my opinion, a pretty solid, steady wide receiver 2 role over the next few years, but has wide receiver 1 upside, Khalil Shakir is that guy. I've acquired him in several different leagues, and you can get him for a 3rd round pick. I mean, that's all it's going to take for him. I don't think it's going to, be something where you're going to have to be worried about what you give up, or, oh my gosh, I got to part with, so-and-so player that also has a high upside. It's not going to take that much. I think generally that people believe it's Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel, Dalton Kincaid is going to get a bunch of targets. Dalton Kincaid might end up being second. I mean, he honestly could be first in this team on targets. So that certainly is a little bit of a thorn in the side of this receiver room. But at wide receiver 59, I mean, come on. It's too low, and I would imagine that will jump up about a solid 20 spots following the season. So that's a pretty huge jump in dynasty value, and I think that'll be because he breaks out. My honorable mentions, like I said, there are a few guys I wanted to touch on, and they're all valued in about the same tier, pretty high, and that is Tank Dell, who's wide receiver 22, Zay Flowers, who's wide receiver 19, and George Pickens at wide receiver 25. So those 3 guys, I didn't include them because I think they're already, close to what their value might be next year. I expect all 3 to be several spots higher, but I don't know that I see any of them taking the jump into the top 10 or anything like that. But certainly a handful of spots for each. I like all 3. I think they're in really good situations. I don't personally think this is a hot take, but I was talking to some people over the last week or so who felt differently. And so I think that Tank Dell and Nico Collins are the wide receivers 1 and 2 on the Texans. I think Stephon Diggs is wide receiver 3. So we'll talk about him on next week's episode. But Nico Collins, I think, especially given that he got a contract extension, that's huge for his value. Tank Dell, I think, is somebody that CJ Stroud loves. So those 2 guys are the 2 wide receivers from the Houston offense that I would be looking to have. Collins already had his breakout last year. He would have been somebody, to target for this type of episode a year ago. But Tank Dell, coming off of his rookie season, coming off the injury, I think that there is still a very high ceiling there. Zay Flowers, he's, all alone, the clear wide receiver 1 in Baltimore, and the same can be said for George Pickens. It just might be a little bit less of a pass-happy offense in Pittsburgh compared to the other 2 guys, but 3 other great players to go target if you need somebody that you can start in your dynasty league. Moving on to tight end, our last position group, and tight ends are always a little bit tougher, I think, to evaluate in terms of breakouts because there's just a smaller player pool in a way to look at because it's pretty clear kind of who the top 10, tight ends are. And we saw guys last year break out that were rookies, which is pretty rare at that position. As you've probably noticed, we're not talking about any rookies on this show because I don't really think it's fair to call a rookie having a good season a breakout. I think we're really looking more at those players who have underperformed and then taking that huge next step, or it's really all about taking that next level from whether it be from average to good or from good to great or elite. I think that's really what we're looking for. And so at tight end, there's just less margin for error. And so I do have 3 players that I think will all take pretty significant jumps in value from now till this time next year. And so I'll start with my favorite sleeper, probably. He's certainly one of my top sleepers among all positions, but he's certainly my number one at tight end, who I think is in line for a big year, and that is Tucker Kraft, tight end for the Green Bay Packers. He's tight end 22. He's 23 years old. He's valued behind Luke Musgrave by several spots on Keep Trade Cut, which I think, while there is some sense to that, given that Musgrave started the year as the starter, was drafted ahead of Kraft, I don't know that Musgrave is going to be able to hold on to that starting job. I think that by the end of the season, this will be Tucker Kraft's job. It kind of seemed like that to end last season, and certainly Musgrave's injury played into that. But Tucker Kraft was very good when he took over later in the season, November, December. Played really well. He received more targets in the playoffs than Luke Musgrave. It was 9-7. So I don't think there's really this huge gap, or that Musgrave is somebody that you have to go get because he's this next young great tight end. I think that very well could be Kraft, and so I think that Kraft is a huge buy right now. I think he's going to have the breakout season, take over the starting job from Musgrave, and assuming that he's healthy. Now, that's a big issue that came up the past couple weeks here. Tucker Kraft was injured during off-season workouts, and he's going to be out until at least training camp. So we never like drafting players that suffer injuries in August or anything like that. This is early enough that as long as he can be ready to go for the preseason, I'll still feel good about this. That's just something to put in the back of your head to monitor later in the summer and as we get closer to the season, because if he's not able to get on the field at all, his chances of overtaking that job and keeping it will certainly be much slimmer. But as it stands, if we project that he's going to be back out there healthy, ready to go, Tucker Kraft is the tight end that I am targeting on the Packers. Number 2 on my breakout list at tight end is Pat Freiermuth, who is currently valued as the tight end 15 on Keep Trade Cut. And I think this is somebody that has a ton of potential. He's certainly flashed and been a good tight end. He's been somebody, I think, another guy that's probably one of those post-hype breakouts where he struggled with some injuries last year. The offense in general just wasn't that good. Kenny Pickett, they didn't have the best chemistry. So, but now Deontay Johnson is gone, new coaching staff, and while it may be a bit more of a run-heavy attack, Russell Wilson is still an upgrade over Kenny Pickett. Justin Fields also would be an upgrade. So kind of regardless of how the quarterback spot shakes out, I like the situation for Freiermuth. Frankly, even if Justin Fields, who's supposed to be the backup right now, he had a great relationship with Cole Kmet, who saw his breakout with Fields. So regardless of whether it's Wilson, Fields, it's all the same for me in terms of Freiermuth being a breakout candidate, because he's probably the number 2 target in the Pittsburgh passing offense. I think Roman Wilson probably ends up taking over the second wide receiver role at some point early in the season. But it's going to be George Pickens, and then to me it will be Freiermuth as the number 2, and then Roman Wilson as the third target in this offense. So again, assuming health, as with all the guys on this list, I think that Freiermuth is somebody that I expect to jump into the top 10 at the tight end position in terms of dynasty value come next offseason. And last but not least is Daniel Bellinger of the New York Giants, who is being valued at tight end 27. He's 23 years old, and he's had a couple flashes here and there, stepping in when Darren Waller has been injured. And Theo Johnson is getting a lot of buzz right now as a rookie coming into the Giants, as potentially being the Darren Waller replacement should he retire. Number one, we don't actually know that Darren Waller is retiring yet. There's a lot of speculation. There's been a lot of talk about it. But as of right now, he is still, on the team, expected to play. So until that changes, the hype is a little bit, muted here for guys like Bellinger and Theo Johnson, because there won't be a breakout if Waller doesn't retire. However, if he does, it's Bellinger that I expect to take over as the starter at least. He's certainly going to get the first crack at it, in my opinion. And I think this is somebody that can do something with that role. Daniel Jones is going to have to step up this year. I think he knows that his job is not going to be guaranteed. If he has a poor season, he's coming off of an injury. And outside of Malik Neighbors, things are pretty wide open in the passing offense for the Giants. So I'm perfectly fine with taking a shot on Daniel Bellinger. I think that a breakout is coming as long as Darren Waller does in fact retire. And I would imagine that he will jump up. I don't know that he's going to be somebody that breaks out to the level of, being a top 10, top 12 dynasty tight end, but certainly somebody that should jump into the mid-teens, which, moving up 10 plus spots, I think that's a pretty big jump and would indicate that he had a pretty nice season, taking over that job in the Giants offense. So there you have it. Those are my breakout picks. I want to jump on those early in the offseason, kind of call my shot on some of these guys. Some of these players, of course, are a little bit more obvious than others, but I do think that each player on this list will be valued more than they are right now at this time next year. So this will be an interesting episode to come back to a year from now, see how we did, and let's just run through each player again really quick before signing off. And at quarterback, our three breakouts were Anthony Richardson, Trevor Lawrence, and Will Levis. At running back, our three breakouts were Zamir White, Chase Brown, and Jaleel McLaughlin. And at wide receiver, we have Drake London, Christian Watson, and Khalil Shakir. And then at tight end, we have Tucker Kraft, Pat Freiermuth, and Daniel Bellinger. So there you have it. Next week, we're going to talk dynasty busts, players that I think are going to have massive drop-offs in dynasty value after this season because of their production on the field, not just because of their age. So stay tuned for that. We also, again, reminder, we're going to have an announcement, so you won't want to miss that. We'll do that next week. And with that, thank you all for listening. We appreciate you. And this is the Dynasty War Room podcast, and we'll talk to you all next week.